Hello, I'm Louise Whittaker, a member of the Battlefields Trust, the UK charity dedicated to preserving, interpreting and promoting British battlefields. For my latest presentation, I'd like to talk about the Battle of Bramham Moor. Some of you may be familiar with the Battle of Shrewsbury, a hard-fought contest which resulted in a royal army led by King Henry IV, defeating and killing Henry Percy, or Hotspur as he is better known, the son of the first Earl of Northumberland. While Shrewsbury was undoubtedly a major victory for the fledgling Lancastrian regime, the Percy threat from the Earl of Northumberland remained for a further 5 years, until it ended in Yorkshire on a bitterly cold day, the 19th of February 1408. It seems strange that the family who had been at the forefront of Henry Bolingbroke's success in gaining the crown in 1399 should, only a few years later, openly rebel against him. Indeed, it was Northumberland himself who tricked Richard II into leaving Conway Castle to meet Bolingbroke at Flint Castle, only for the Earl's armed men to ambush and capture the king en route. Northumberland, a veteran of Edward III's wars in France, was already in his late 50s by this time. By 1403, three main factors, financial, territorial and dynastic, had alienated the new king and the Percy family. On the financial front, the Percys raised a number of complaints to Henry IV concerning lack of money from the Crown to prosecute their defence of the Welsh and Scottish borders. Following Henry's accession, they had been handsomely rewarded with several offices, including the wardenship of both the east and west marches with Scotland, as well as posts for Hotspur in North Wales. Between 1399 and 1403 they received financial support of nearly £40,000. But repeatedly protested that their soldiers were short of funds, payments were delayed, and that they were forced to pay their men out of their own pockets. The Crown itself had financial problems, and the eagerness of both the Scottish and Welsh to exploit Henry IV's insecurity may have caused more problems, and therefore more financial outlay, than the Percys had anticipated. Territorially, a rivalry had already been established in Richard II's time between the Percys and Ralph Neville, created Earl of Westmoreland by Richard. Westmoreland's second marriage to Joan Beaufort in 1396 now made him the new king's brother-in-law, and in Percy eyes a threat to their wealth and influence in their northern heartlands. Local rivalries were to continue to play a part in the Wars of the Roses later in the century. Dynastically, Hotspur's wife Elizabeth was a sister of Edmund Mortimer, uncle to the 12-year-old Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, who had himself a claim to the throne of England, and one that, it could be argued, was better than Henry IV's, as it came via Edward III's second son, not the third son of the Lancastrian line. Percy's support for Henry in 1399 had prevented this being an issue, but when Hotspur's Mortimer brother-in-law was subsequently captured by the Welsh rebel Owen Glyndŵr, and Henry IV refused to ransom him, to the annoyance of Hotspur, the deteriorating relations between the king and his erstwhile supporters made it significant. Once the Percys had decided to rebel and thrown in their lot with Glyndŵr, Henry IV probably saw all too clearly their links with the Mortimers and the possible attractions of a child king for his powerful relations. At the outset of the reign, he had taken the young Edmund Mortimer and his brother into protective custody at Windsor. The catalyst for rebellion was the Percy victory over the Scots at the Battle of Hambledon Hill in 1402, where a number of important prisoners, including the Scottish leader Archibald Douglas, were captured. The Percys hoped to ransom their prisoners, as was the usual custom. In this case, however, Henry IV asserted his right to the prisoners being handed over to the Crown. While Northumberland complied, Hotspur refused to return his prisoners, who included Douglas, and chronicles also report him quarrelling bitterly with Henry IV, either over the king's refusal to ransom Edmund Mortimer or over tardy payments of money. Despite these tensions, the king granted Northumberland the earldom of Douglas in the spring of 1403, but these lands lay in Scotland and would have to be conquered without any financial help. A few months later, Hotspur raised the flag of rebellion, only to be killed at the Battle of Shrewsbury on the 21st of July, 1403. The Earl of Northumberland had not been present at Shrewsbury. He had stayed in the north, and the king ordered the Earl of Westmoreland to move against him, with himself not far behind. Having heard of the defeat at Shrewsbury, Northumberland took refuge in the Percy stronghold of Warkworth Castle, from where he was summoned to appear before the king at York. He denied any knowledge of the rebellion, and was given the opportunity to plead his case before his peers in Parliament. In January 1404 he was found guilty of trespass rather than treason, although the Percys lost the wardenships of the west and east marches to the Earl of Westmoreland and Prince John of Lancaster respectively. Henry IV still entertained doubts about the Earl's loyalty, and he was right to do so. In February 1405 Northumberland came to an agreement, known as the tripartite indenture, with Owen Glyndwr and his ex-captive turned son-in-law, Edmund Mortimer. This divided England and Wales between them. It was no doubt linked to the temporary escape from custody of the young Edmund Mortimer and his brother, although they were swiftly recaptured. Northumberland also planned to join Archbishop Scrope of York's rising, which complained against taxation and called for reform in the royal government. Anticipating the Earl of Westmoreland's resistance to any rebellion, Northumberland attempted, with his friend and ally Lord Bardolph, to capture Westmoreland at his castle at Wittonley Weir in Durham, an attempt that failed as Westmoreland had already left. Following this disappointment they retreated north, and were not present at Shipton Moor when Westmoreland tricked Scrope and his fellow rebel, the Earl of Norfolk, into disbanding their army, before arresting them. Declared traitors themselves, Northumberland and Bardolph fled via Berwick to Scotland. Westmoreland benefited from his success in defeating the rebels without significant bloodshed, and received a large grant of former Percy lands in Cumberland and Northumberland in June 1405. With his estates confiscated and a price on his head, Northumberland spent a couple of years in exile with Lord Bardolph, in Scotland, Wales, and on the continent, before they returned to Scotland again in 1407 and set about raising an army for yet another rebellion. The force was comprised of Lowland Scottish knights and Northumbrians, and it was hoped that more men would join them as they moved south. They seem to have made a deliberate decision to attack in winter, when the king would least suspect it, but unfortunately the winter of 1407–8 proved to be a particularly harsh one, with snow from December until March. Thomas Walsingham's chronicle mentions that due to the heavy snowfall, almost all the thrushes and blackbirds died of hunger and cold. At Thirsk, Northumberland and Bardolph issued a proclamation inviting the people to rise and support them against the unjust oppression of the Crown, although of those who did, few possessed any military experience. Walsingham also mentions the rebel army plundering the local countryside, which could hardly have made them popular. Having heard of the rebellion on the 15th of February, Henry IV ordered forces to be raised against them and prepared to march north. In the meantime, Sir Thomas Rokeby, the High Sheriff of Yorkshire, gathered an army of trained men and managed to block the rebel army's progress south at Grimbold Bridge near Knaresborough, probably preventing further recruitment by Northumberland from the Percy manor at Spofforth, and forcing the rebels to march east before continuing south. Rokeby had Neville affiliations, having acted as a trustee for the Lincolnshire properties of the Earl of Westmoreland's son-in-law. The rebel forces moved via Wetherby and Tadcaster before deciding to chance their luck in battle. Rokeby followed the rebels and set watches of guards around Tadcaster, so the traitors could not get away without some sort of fight. It's estimated that Northumberland and Bardolph can have had no more than about 500 men when they met the royalist forces of perhaps twice this number on Bramham Moor. The battle ranged over the area south of Bramham village, bounded by Camp Hill, Headley Hall and the Oglethorpe Hills. If you look at Camp Hill today, it doesn't look much of a slope, but there has been a levelling effect of centuries of farming on what is believed to be an early hill fort. and with the rebels arriving first, they chose the highest ground to make their stand. In 1408, Bramham Moor was essentially uncultivated moorland. Battle was joined at 2 p.m. The Scottish troops amongst the rebels preferred the impetus of a downhill charge, but the success of this depended largely upon how disciplined their enemies were, and the greater cohesion of the royalist forces, who also had the advantage of longbows, helped to thin the charging ranks before the two armies clashed. There appear to have been few niceties. According to Walsingham's Chronicle, the sheriff unveiled a banner of St. George, and both he and Northumberland unveiled pennons of their arms. What is described as a relatively short but furious and bloody melee commenced. Lord Bardolph was mortally wounded early in the action and died later. The 66-year-old Northumberland was said to have been killed fighting in the thick of the battle. There is some confusion about whether he survived to be executed afterwards, but he may have already been dead when his head was cut off. There used to be a small stone cross in a field near Oglethorpe Wynn Covert, just north of Tulston Lane, said to mark the spot where the Earl died. Total battle casualties are unknown. The Earl's head, full of silver hoary hairs, was set on a stake and carried to London, where it was put up on London Bridge as a monument to divine justice. He was also quartered, and the four parts of his torso were exposed at Newcastle, Berwick, York and Lincoln. Bardolph's head, together with one of his quarters, was also sent to London. After the Earl's remains had been displayed for several months, they were buried at the right side of the high altar in York Minster, beside the grave of his son, Hotspur. 16 other rebels were beheaded and quartered, and when King Henry arrived in York, many more were condemned to death, and others heavily fined. Some of the unknown dead from the battlefield now lie in 2 communal graves at the east end of Bramham churchyard, where cherry trees stand today. The fortunes of war are illustrated by the fates of the Abbot of Hales and the Bishop of Bangor, both of whom were with the rebel army. The former, taken in complete armour, was executed, whereas the bishop, who was dressed as a priest, was spared. For this victory, Sheriff Sir Thomas Rokeby received a grant for life of Spofforth, one of the largest Percy manors in Yorkshire, from a grateful King Henry. With both the threat of rebellion in the north of England and the Earl of Northumberland himself removed, the Percy challenge to Henry IV was at an end. The king was now able to direct all his forces against the Welsh, and, when Harlech Castle fell in the following year, Owen Glyndŵr disappeared. It can therefore be said that the battle here at Bramham Moor effectively secured the position of the Lancastrian monarchy for the next half-century, until it came to grief only half a dozen miles away, at Towton battlefield. If we look at the battlefield today at Bramham, there's a footpath across the moor between Bramham village and Spencommon Lane, which crosses the battlefield, running parallel to the modern A1. Camp Hill lies west of this path. Turning east onto Spencommon Lane, you can walk towards Tulston Lane. All this area would have formed part of the battleground. By 1952, the Percy Cross had already been moved a couple of times and was situated in Black Wood, just south of Tulston Lane, a site difficult to access for anyone wanting to take a look, as there was no roadside footpath. The cross had already been broken by the 1930s, when it was moved from the middle to the side of the original field, as it was in the farmer's way. An indication we have of its possible appearance may be seen from surviving Percy crosses at the battlefields of Otterburn and Hedgeley Moor. In 2019, the Bramham Historic Asset Conservation Group obtained both local and national permissions to move the Percy Cross into the churchyard of All Saints in Bramham itself, where it may be seen today. This fine battlefield information board and the battle marker are also due to be erected at new sites. This is the battle marker. If you like this presentation and the Battlefield Trust's YouTube content, Please visit our Facebook and Twitter sites, and also our website, where you can learn more about us and read about a large number of British battles and battlefields. It's also possible to make a donation to our charity here. Thank you very much.